Ladies and gentlemen, in the last lecture we left the British government desperately trying to resolve the Irish question, and they had a conference at Buckingham Palace in July 1914, and then in Winston Churchill's words, after one of the sessions of the conference, a note was brought in which said that Austria had sent an ultimatum to Serbia, and Churchill wrote, it was an ultimatum such as had never been penned in modern times. As the reading proceeded, it seemed absolutely impossible that any state in the world could accept it, or that any acceptance, however abject, would satisfy the aggressor. And then he said, the parishes of Fermanagh and Tyrone faded back into the mists and squalls of Ireland, and a strange light began to fall upon the map of Europe. Now, at the end of the war, Churchill wrote this: "Then came the Great War. Every institution almost in the world was strained. Great empires have been overturned. The whole map of Europe has been changed. The position of countries has been violently altered. The modes of thought of men, the whole outlook on affairs, the grouping of parties, all have encountered violent and tremendous changes in the deluge of the world. But as the deluge subsides and the waters fall short, we see the dreary steeples of Fermanagh and Tyrone emerging once again. The integrity of their quarrel is one of the few institutions that has been unaltered in the cataclysm that has swept the world." And in those comments, Churchill was saying two things. First, the war had changed everything. Secondly, it hadn't changed anything in Ireland, though that is not quite true. The war had changed something in Ireland, and namely the Irish Nationalist Party was more or less wiped out, and the Sinn Féin party took its place, winning almost all the seats in Republican Ireland. And Sinn Féin, unlike the Nationalists, refused to take their seats at Westminster, and they set up their own parliament, the Dáil in Dublin, and declared Irish independence. The British government refused to recognise that. There was a rather futile guerrilla war, many shocking reprisals, but in the end the government settled with Sinn Féin in 1921, and Ireland outside Ulster became in effect independent. So it wasn't quite true that nothing had changed in Ireland. Some things had changed. But Churchill was quite right to speak of the cataclysm which affected Britain, and I think affected Britain more than the Second World War in many ways. In the First World War, 1 in 10 men under 45 were killed, and the killing was particularly marked amongst those who volunteered for war in 1914. And a later Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, said that when he looked at a photograph of his fellow undergraduates at Balliol College, Oxford, there were only 2 other scholars in his year who survived. And he said Oxford at the end of the war was a city of ghosts. And he said the rest of his year, he said, had been, as he put it, sent down by the Kaiser. 300,000 of those killed were in unknown graves, and 3 million families lost a family member, a husband or a son or a father. And it's understandable that people called the war to end war, and the slogan in 1918 was "Never Again." And at the end of the war there was a fairly violent reaction against Germany, and people said that Germany had to pay for the cost of the war in reparations, and that German war criminals should be tried. That mood gradually disappeared, and by the beginning of the 1930s there came to be a general feeling that perhaps the war had been a mistake and caused by accidental and contingent factors, particularly the building up of armaments on each side, great alliances and so on, that the war had risen from misunderstandings. It could have been avoided. And that atmosphere in the 1930s contributed very heavily to the policy of appeasement followed by British governments towards dictators, Mussolini and Hitler, in the 1930s. But the main emphasis, I think, of the appeasement policy, and this is the theme for the next lecture, but it stems, I think, from the First World War, the idea of never again, that no sensible, rational person would ever wish to start another war, and therefore British governments should do all they could to remove causes of grievance and try and achieve settlements so that we didn't have to fight ever again, and certainly we should never have a large army such as had been slaughtered in Flanders again, and therefore even when we began to rearm in the 1930s, the rearmament was concentrated on the Air Force to deter an aggressor, and to some extent on the Navy and not on the Army. And when in 1939 the British government sought an alliance with the Soviet Union to try and secure collective action against Nazi Germany, Stalin asked Britain how many divisions Britain would be able to put into the field against Nazi Germany. And the British government said 4. And Stalin said, well, the Soviet Union has 500 divisions, so that makes 504. And so it's understandable that Stalin didn't take the British government's protestations of collective security very seriously. But the reason for that, it all stems back to the First World War. I think we can't exaggerate the effects on that in international affairs, and that's what I'm going to talk about next time. But today I'm going to talk primarily about domestic affairs. And there too, the war changed, I think, everything. If you look at politics in 1914, the outbreak of war, you can see you have a liberal government, the opposition is conservative, and you have an Irish party, which, as I said, was to disappear entirely from Parliament. And that's very important because the Irish returned at every election between 80 and 86 MPs. And that meant that unless you got a very large majority, you'd be dependent on the Irish for your majority. If you play back history since 1918 and assume that 80 odd Irish MPs were there, I mean, the character of governments had been very different. For example, in 1979, Margaret Thatcher won an overall majority of 43, but she wouldn't have had an overall majority if there'd been 80 odd Irish MPs there, it's clear. So that made an important difference. And you also had a very small Labour Party of 42 MPs, and most of those had won their seats through the aid of the Liberals. They'd won in seats where Liberals had withdrawn candidates. Very few won against the other two major parties. And in every by-election between 1910 and 1940, in every three-cornered by-election, the Labour candidate came third. Now, if you look at 1922, you see a quite different picture. Firstly, you have a Conservative government in power after the overthrow of the Lloyd-George coalition. But the opposition is then the Labour Party. And the Liberal Party is divided and not a party of government anymore, and indeed was not to be in government in peacetime again except in coalitions in 1931, the wartime coalition, and of course today, but there's never been a Liberal Prime Minister since 1922. That was a great change. And that change came about in 3 stages. There were 3 coups, if you like, by which that position was achieved. The first came in 1915, about 7 or 8 months after the outbreak of war, in May 1915, when the last purely liberal government disappeared, and Asquith, the Liberal Prime Minister, formed an all-party coalition government to prosecute the war more effectively. And that was the first government that saw the entry of the Labour Party into government. Arthur Henderson, the leader of the Labour Party, became a minister in that government, in the cabinet. Henderson became leader of the Labour Party, I should say, after the outbreak of war, because he supported the war, whereas the previous leader of the Labour Party, Ramsay MacDonald, who became Prime Minister between the wars, Ramsay MacDonald was opposed to the war. And Ramsay MacDonald spoke in Parliament against war in 1914, but was repudiated by the MPs and the National Executive and the trade unions of the Labour Party, and MacDonald therefore resigned. And there was a deep split in the Labour Party. People talk a lot about the split in the Liberals, but they forget the Labour Party was split on a very fundamental issue, whether we should go to war at all. But the bulk of the Labour Party and the trade unions in particular, who were the kind of ballast of the Labour Party, supported the war. And I think they represented the organised working class in that sense, who, from what we know, there weren't opinion polls in those days, but from what we know, were even more determined on war, more patriotic, if you like, than other social groups. But at any rate, this was an all-party government in 1915. The Irish party supported it. They supported the war, and indeed they were offered places in the government, but declined to take them up. There was an all-party government. And the Asquith government was displaced in December 1916 by a new coalition government led by Lloyd George. But this was not an all-party government because one wing of the Liberal Party, led by Asquith, did not support it. It had the support of the Conservatives and of the Labour Party, and Labour continued to be represented in it until 1918, when there was an election, and the coalition minus the Labour Party, that is the Lloyd George Liberals and the Conservatives, stood together as a coalition and won the election with a landslide, and Labour moved into opposition and the Asquith Liberals moved into opposition. So you had two wings of the Liberal Party. And in 1918, Lloyd George's position seemed impregnable. He was, as it was said colloquially, the man who won the war. And the leader of the Conservative Party at the time, number 2 in the coalition, Andrew Bonar Law, said Lloyd George can be Prime Minister for life if he likes. But in 1922, the coalition was destroyed. And this was the third coup. The coalition was destroyed to be replaced by a purely Conservative government led by Andrew Bonar Law, who in 1918 had said Lloyd George can be Prime Minister for life if he likes. And when Lloyd George went to resign for the King, George V put in his diary, he said, he will be back, I am sure. But he never held office again, and he lived for another 23 years, a Member of Parliament, but was never again in office after 1922. So far from being Prime Minister for life, he was only Prime Minister for another 4 years. Now, this coalition was set up to meet a new mood, which it was said the war had engendered. And this mood, I think, had two components. The first being a positive mood, and the second a negative one. But the positive mood, very understandably, was that you were going to be dealing with a new world after the war. That life is going to be very different. And the old issues on which the parties had fought, like free trade and protection, disestablishment of the Church of England, Irish Home Rule, these were somehow moving into the background, and that there would be new socio-economic issues which required transcending of the old political lines and people confronting these issues without the old dogmas, with perhaps a fresh mind. And again, Winston Churchill summed up this very well in an election speech in 1918. He was a strong supporter of the coalition. He was a Lloyd George Liberal, not an Asquith Liberal. He said, "Why is it, if men and women of all classes, all parties, are able to work together for 5 years like a mighty machine to produce destruction, why can they not work together for another 5 years to produce abundance?" And the Cabinet in 1920, in the minutes of the Cabinet conclusions, said the only justification for the existence of the present form of government was that it attempted to hold the balance evenly and fairly between all classes of the community. And it seems to me perhaps all this has some relevance or resonance for the present coalition government as well, that it would hold the balance fairly. And one historian has said, I think there's some truth in this, that the coalition did transform Britain from being what you might call an unreconstructed capitalist society into a more regulated one. And that this is a more important change socially than anything that's occurred in the 20th century, more important than that achieved by the Attlee government, which built on those foundations, that what had begun as an unregulated capitalism became more regulated as a result of the Lloyd George government. Now, in international affairs too, it was hoped you'd be in a new world in the post-war era with the League of Nations, and that instead of national conflicts you'd have international arbitration. And one supporter of the coalition government of Lloyd George went so far as to suggest that the coalition was a natural corollary to the League of Nations. And therefore, the coalition, it was argued, would give a vision of social harmony over and above class conflict and international conciliation, so to appeal to ideals and create a kind of middle way in politics, if you like. But there was also a negative element which rather contradicted the positive. And that negative element, and I think you can't overemphasize it, difficult to imagine today, it was characterized by fear. People were very frightened. And they were frightened of the left. They were frightened of the trade unions. They were frightened of a general strike. And they were frightened of what they called Bolshevism, which they equated, it may seem odd today, they equated with the new Labour Party. One has to get back to that atmosphere. You'd seen a Bolshevik revolution in Russia in 1917, which frightened many people, and then the spread of revolutions at the end of the war in Central and Eastern Europe. And people said there's a great danger that we may have communism or something similar here, and therefore we need a strong government which can deal with that. And of course, there wasn't as much contact, I think, between social classes as there was today, and very few people in government knew much about the trade union movement or the history of the Labour Party, or they wouldn't have been so frightened. But they actually were. And there's a very interesting example of this, that in February 1920, the Deputy Cabinet Secretary, a man called Tom Jones, he kept a diary, which I think is illegal. You can't do it now, but he kept a diary. And he recorded a meeting of Lloyd George with his advisors. And the Home Secretary at that meeting said that he outlined his proposals to raise a special temporary force of 10,000 soldiers for the national emergency, that was strikes, the existing police force being inadequate. And the food controller said there are large groups preparing for Soviet government. The First Lord of the Admiralty said the peaceable manpower of the country is without arms. I have not a pistol less than 200 years old. Bogdanor, the Conservative leader, summed up the discussion by saying that all weapons ought to be available for distribution to the friends of the government. And the President of the Board of Trade pointed to the universities as full of trained men who would cooperate with clerks and stockbrokers. They're different then from today, I suppose. He said the universities were full of trained men who could cooperate with clerks and stockbrokers. And the Deputy Cabinet Secretary said during the discussion, Bogdanor so often referred to the stockbrokers as a loyal and fighting class until one felt that potential battalions of stockbrokers were to be found in every town. Now, Lloyd George was very skillful in diffusing what amounted, I think, not to revolutionary feeling, but to trade union militancy. And a key moment in that diffusing of militancy occurred in 1921 in an episode that has gone down in trade union history as Black Friday. And I think Black Friday is more important for the diffusing of militancy than the general strike of 1926. But what happened in Black Friday was this, that three of the main unions had got together in a grouping called the Triple Alliance, and they'd said that if any one of them went on strike, the other two would join together in a sympathetic strike. And these unions were the miners, the transport workers and the railwaymen. And you can see if they all got together in a sympathetic strike, it would have a much greater effect than one of them going on strike, and you'd have in effect a general strike, a great pressure against the government. Now, in 1921, the Lloyd George government decided to decontrol or denationalise the mines, which had been nationalised during the war for temporary wartime reasons. And they were going to bring them back to private ownership. And now 1921 saw the beginning of the post-war slump, and the owners said they would not employ the miners at the same wages that they'd had under nationalisation, but would have to lower the wages. And the miners, not unnaturally, said they would resist that, and the owners said, very well, in that case, when the mines are denationalised, we won't admit anyone to work except at the lower rate of wages. And the miners said, well, this we will not accept. And they said, we demand two things. First, we demand a better wage settlement. And secondly, we demand national wage settlements, because the wages of miners differed in different parts of the country according to the profitability of the mines. So that if you worked in an area where the mines weren't very profitable, the wages were lower than where they were. So they said we demand settlement at national level and also a decent level of wages. And all appeared ready for a general strike on that issue. When on the Friday, that is Black Friday, the secretary of the Miners' Union, who was a moderate, called Frank Hodges, her name was blackened in trade union history by the left, he addressed a meeting of coalition supporters, MPs, in the House of Commons. And he was asked if we can get a decent settlement for the wages that you want, would you be prepared to put the issue of national wage settlement on the back burner for the time being? Would you be prepared to leave that aside to be settled later? And Hodges, who had no notes of that question, said, yes, I think my executive would consider that. And this was immediately conveyed to Lloyd George, who acted rapidly, and called Hodges in and said, we'll settle with you on the wages if you forget about the national pool, the national settlement. And when Hodges went back to his executive, he was repudiated by one vote, and the executive said, we're still going on strike. Now, the other unions hearing all this said, well, why are we going on strike if the miners can't make up their mind? And it's important to note that going on strike in those days was very different from today, because if you went on strike, you would not necessarily, or indeed very likely on the railways, be reinstated at your old wages. That given that there was a depression and much unemployment, the railway owners would say that in 1926, we're only going to take you back since you've gone on strike at lower wages. So you were actually taking a great risk, more than you are today, if you went on strike. And it was understandable. The other unions said, well, the miners can't make up their mind. Why should we ask our people to risk themselves for that? And so the other unions, led by the railwaymen's leader, J.H. Thomas, Jimmy Thomas, who was going to be a minister in Ramsay MacDonald's government and was known by the left after this as Traitor Thomas, they said, we're not going to join you in this strike at all, and you'll have to go on your own. And they said, people said to Thomas, you've sold us out, and Thomas replied, perhaps unkindly, I tried to sell you, but I couldn't find a buyer. But the miners then were locked out. It wasn't a strike, they were locked out for some months in a rather futile struggle, and their wages were duly reduced. And that became a warning in trade union history. It led to the general strike, because the unions said we're not going to be betrayed in that way again. But it diffused trade union militancy at what I think a more serious time of trouble for the government than 1926. But all this time, the coalition government, understandably, was losing this aura it had at the beginning of holding the balance fairly between all classes, being a new start and all the rest of it, and appeared nothing more than an anti-socialist front, a party of the right. But if that was so, why did you need a coalition at all? Because surely the Conservative Party would be just as good at representing an anti-socialist front, if that was what you want, as the coalition. And all this time, Conservatives in the country were reacting against coalition. And the revolt which destroyed the Lloyd George coalition came not from the leadership or the MPs, but from the grassroots of the Conservative Party. Now, Conservative constituency associations were beginning to adopt candidates who were opposed to the continuation of the coalition. They said, we want a Conservative government led by a Conservative Prime Minister. Now, that wasn't the policy of the Conservative Party at the top. The policy of the Conservative Party at the top was, we're supporting a coalition government with a non-Conservative Lloyd George as Prime Minister. I mean, Lloyd George was called many things in his career, not always complimentary, but never a Conservative, I think. No one ever thought he was a Conservative. Now, although these Conservative candidates supported a policy directly opposite to that of the leadership, they couldn't be repudiated by the leadership because they'd been adopted by constituency associations in a perfectly normal constitutional way. They'd chosen their candidates, as they're perfectly entitled to do. They were autonomous bodies. And by 1922, over 180 Conservatives opposed to the coalition had been chosen as candidates by their constituency associations. And this grassroots revolt ensured the downfall of the coalition, because if the leadership ignored it, it would be the leadership that went and not the grassroots. Now, as it was bad luck for the coalition, in 1921, Baldwin, the Conservative leader, retired through ill health and was succeeded by Austin Chamberlain, the son of Joe Chamberlain and the half-brother of Neville Chamberlain. And Austin Chamberlain, I think, amidst much competition, wins the prize for the most foolish Conservative leader of the 20th century. Because he said he was going to face down the rebels and show them what's what and who the leader was. Now, the rebels, there was going to be a Conservative Party conference in November 1922, at which the constituency associations would be naturally strong and powerful, and the fear of Chamberlain, Austin Chamberlain, was that that would mount a demonstration against the coalition. So he thought of a plan to defeat this. And he said, we're going to call a party meeting, and a party meeting would be of MPs and not of candidates. And we'll tell them bluntly, they must either follow our advice or do without us, in which case they must find their own chief and form a government at once. And they would be in a damned fix. In other words, he took the view that so many leaders have taken, they were indispensable. And that wasn't the case. Now, if the Chamberlain then called a meeting of MPs at the Carlton Club, Conservative MPs, and if the Conservative MPs had voted to continue the coalition, there would have been a split in the party, as occurred under Sir Robert Peel in 1846, and the party might have been in opposition for a long time. So the rejection of the coalition was inevitable. And the crucial issue was, could you find a leader who would take up the cause of the constituency associations and the candidates who said we want a Conservative government with a Conservative Prime Minister? And the cause was taken up by Baldwin, who came out of retirement to lead the revolt, and by someone hitherto unknown, who would be a dominant figure in the interwar period, Stanley Baldwin, who was a junior cabinet minister in the coalition, whom no one took much notice of, and seemingly of no great weight. Now, one of Baldwin's allies was asked as they went into the Carlton Club, what is going to happen at this meeting? And he replied, a slice off the top. And what he meant was the local constituency parties had already decided against the coalition, and therefore any leaders who didn't support that would be sliced off the top. They would be repudiated, which was what happened. And at the Carlton Club meeting, the coalition was rejected by 187 votes to 87, and every major figure in the Conservative Party organisation, the chief whip, the chairman of the party, they all voted against the continuation of the coalition. And it's a very interesting case study, which I hope the present Prime Minister and leader of the Liberal Democrats are studying, that coalitions collapse not from the top, but from the bottom, when the followers no longer follow the leaders. Now, interesting constitutionally as a result of that collapse, because Lloyd George, when he heard of the vote, immediately resigned. He didn't wait for any vote in the House of Commons. You may say the party meeting has no constitutional significance. He immediately resigned. And the King, thereupon, called Baldwin. He couldn't call Austin Chamberlain because he'd been repudiated. But Baldwin said, look, I'm not going to agree to be Prime Minister till I've actually got the votes of Conservative MPs who've chosen me as party leader. And that didn't happen for 4 days. It was a very interesting constitutional innovation. We were without a Prime Minister for 4 days. And lucky there wasn't a terrorist attack perhaps during that period, but we were without a Prime Minister. Now, Baldwin survived only for 6 months. He was already a very sick man, and after 6 months he resigned. He was suffering from cancer of the throat and died soon afterwards, and was succeeded by this hitherto unknown person who had a very rapid rise, Stanley Baldwin. And Baldwin, a remarkable figure, because until his mid-50s, he was almost completely unknown. He fought as a Conservative candidate at the age of 40 in 1906, but got nowhere in the Liberal landslide, and he got in 1908 in a by-election at the age of 42. In his first 8 years in Parliament, he spoke 5 times and thought of leaving the House of Commons. He was thought of as a candidate for the speakership, but that wasn't pursued. But at one time, Bonner Law, who was a widower, was looking for someone who would act as a parliamentary private secretary, do a bit of entertaining, and he landed on Baldwin, who was very agreeable, and Baldwin became a strong Bonner Law supporter and rose from there, but really, on the whole, quite insignificant until the meeting at the Carlton Club, which rather made him. And he said, well, the Conservative Party mustn't be this such a strong anti-socialist front as before, and we really should be a more conciliatory sort of government. He was very much like John Major, I think, in many respects. But as I've said, the immediate post-war years were dominated under the Conservative government as much as the coalition government by the theme of labour militancy and the seeming challenge from the trade unions and the left. And I've already mentioned the threat of a general strike in 1921, but there was an even earlier one which came to nothing, spearheaded again by the miners in 1919. And at that meeting, Lloyd George summoned the miners' leaders to number 10, and he said this. He said, I feel bound to tell you that in our opinion we are at your mercy. If you carry out your threat and strike, you will defeat us. But if you do so, have you weighed the consequences? The strike will be in defiance of the government of the country, and by its very success will precipitate a constitutional crisis of the first importance. For if a force arises in the state which is stronger than the state itself, then it must be ready to take on the functions of the state, or withdraw and accept the authority of the state. He said, gentlemen, have you considered? And if you have, are you ready? And he got up from the Prime Minister's chair and offered it to the miners' leader, who of course didn't take it. But Lloyd George was making an interesting point, because he said this, the implication was this, that the miners, no doubt, had a claim against the employers, who at that time were the government. And they had a dispute, if you like, with the employers. But what was being threatened was a general strike of other groups, like transport workers and railwomen and others. Now, these other groups had no dispute with their employers. What they were doing was disputing against the government. In other words, what they were doing was going on strike so that the government should change what it deemed its correct policy, a government which had been, after all, elected. And what Lloyd George was saying is, if the trade union movement can determine the policy of the government against its wishes, then that is the government of the day. There's a force stronger than the government. In other words, the strike wasn't against the employers in the transport area or the railway area. It was actually a strike against government policy, and that was the issue raised in the general strike. So you weren't just extending collective bargaining, you were moving it beyond a trade dispute into a dispute with the government, and that was the issue that Lloyd George was raising, and which was finally settled by the general strike. But there's one sense in which Lloyd George was perhaps speaking in a misleading way, because firstly, no Prime Minister was willing to accept defeat from organised labour, and the country wouldn't let them do that. But secondly, and perhaps most important of all, anyone who'd studied the history of the trade union movement or the Labour Party knew that they weren't going to make that kind of challenge that Lloyd George suggested, and that they weren't interested in overthrowing the state. That wasn't their role. And the trade unions had a very different function. Now, it's certainly true that the trade unions were the key element in the Labour Party in the interwar years. And for example, in 1930, if you look at the Labour Party's income, it's £45 million, but of that, £35 million came from the trade unions. If you look at the national executive, the trade unions were dominant on that. and the trade unions had a block vote at the party conference, which meant they could outnumber easily the constituency party delegates. This was strongly supported by the Fabian theorist Sidney Webb, who in 1930 said this: the constituency parties were frequently unrepresentative groups of non-entities, dominated by fanatics and cranks and extremists. And if the block vote of the trade unions were eliminated, it would be impracticable to continue to vest the control of policies in Labour Party conferences. In other words, the unrealistic people in the constituency party, the trade unions would keep them down to earth. And that was a much truer picture of the unions than the Lloyd George one of a group of revolutionaries threatening to take over the government. The trade unions were very slow-moving, very defensive, very cautious, thoroughly committed to democratic procedures in their actions, which made them extremely cautious. And they were fighting in the 20s as much a defensive and conservative with a small c battle as a radical battle. In other words, what they were trying to do, as you've seen from the examples I've given, they weren't trying to get increases in wages. They were trying to stop wages falling. They were trying to hold on to what they had. Far from making revolutionary or radical demands, they were making a demand that their position not be worsened. And the trade union negotiators were very conservative in that sense. Now, they were attacked throughout, oddly in light of what Lloyd George said, they were attacked throughout by the left wing of the Labour Party, who said that the reactionary leadership of the unions was selling out a radical working class. But those who were closest to the working class in the 1920s saw them as even more conservative and cautious than their leaders. And they said that the members stood not to the left of the leadership, but to the right of the leadership. The leaders declared themselves to be socialists, but how many of the members of the unions were actually socialists? And Ernest Bevin, the leader of the largest union, the Transport and General Workers Union, he said, the most conservative man in the world is a British trade unionist when you want to change him. He said, you can make a great speech on unity, but when you are finished, he will say, what about the funeral benefits? And he wrote to a left-wing trade union leader in 1928. He said, it is all very well for people to talk as if the working class of Great Britain are cracking their shins for a fight and a revolution, and we are holding them back. Are they? There are not many as fast as we are ourselves. Now, the Labour Party, if you leave out the unions, had around 1 million members through most of the interwar period. The main left-wing attack on the Labour Party from the Communist Party in 1921 had 10,000 members. At the height of the slump in 1929, its membership had fallen to 3,500 members. So there's not much sign of a great radical movement to the left of the Labour Party. And the trade unions in the 20s were militant only when their interests were threatened, when they were trying to preserve the status quo. Otherwise, they tended to be very, very defensive and cautious in their approach. Now, the trade unions and the Labour Party, although part of the same labour movement, there wasn't much love lost between them, because the Labour Party took the view, understandably perhaps, that strikes were damaging their electoral prospects, and that frightening middle-class people whose votes they need, as well as working-class people, preventing the rise of labour. And the best way to deal with the problems of the working class was not by strikes or trade union action, but by getting a majority for the Labour Party in Parliament. And in 1924, Henderson, one of the leaders of the Labour Party, said the epidemic of strikes reminds him of what was happening in Russia against the Kerensky government, damaging to a liberal-minded government. Ramsay MacDonald called Bevin a swine for going on strike and damaging Labour's electoral chances. Now, the trade unions themselves thought that that was where the strength of Labour lay, in the collective weight of the working class in the industrial sector and not in the political sector. So there were battles between them. And the big battle came, as I'll describe later, in 1931, when the Labour cabinet wanted to reduce unemployment benefit, but the unions wouldn't agree, and that led to a great split. in the Labour Party. This was masked at the end of the war because for this brief, if you like, idealistic period, the Labour Party took the view that the war had actually destroyed the capitalist system and that people could move on fairly quickly into a new socialist system. And the Labour Party's programme in 1918, which was called Labour and the New Social Order, said that the individualist system of capitalist production may, we hope indeed, have received a death blow. With it must go the political system and ideas in which it naturally found expression. We of the Labour Party, whether in opposition or called upon in due time to form an administration, will certainly lend no hand to its revival. On the contrary, we shall do our utmost to see that it is buried with the millions it has done to death. Now, the interwar years, which were a bleak period for all concerned, were perhaps bleakest of all for the Labour Party, because that diagnosis proved wholly faulty. And instead of the interwar years seeing a steady march towards socialism, you can see it as a great defeat for the left. The general strike in 1926, a defeat for the trade union left. The formation of the national government in 1931 with a vast majority, a great defeat for the political left, really historic defeats. The general strike showed that the left couldn't force the government to meet the demands of the unions. The national government showed that the Labour Party couldn't preserve working class living standards, unemployment benefits and so on in the middle of a slump. And then the left was to suffer another blow in foreign policy in the 1930s because the left's hopes that collective security through the League of Nations could prevent a war was also shown to be futile. So it was a bleak period for the left. Oddly enough, the Labour Party recovered at the worst time of the war in 1940, when they were brought into the government by their most bitter opponent in the interwar years, Winston Churchill, the most bitter opponent of the Labour movement, who brought them into power and helped perhaps to create a period of Labour government after the war, when the age of the Conservatives gave way to the age of the Labour Party. So the left recovered in 1940. And the central theme, I think, of the interwar period is the defeat of the left, partly because the Labour movement and the unions, I think, exaggerated their strength and what they could achieve in the years of slump. Now, firstly, their first doctrine, as I've said, was that they could bring about socialism through industrial action, and that was decided it couldn't in 1926, despite the Labour militancy. And we've already seen that in 1921 there was a threat of a general strike, which came to nothing, but that threat was renewed in 1925, when again the mines had been in private ownership for some time, and the miners again said, we will not accept wage reductions. The owners were saying, we can't keep the mines open at current rates, we can't make enough profit, can't stay in business, I'm afraid we'll have to lower the wages. And the miners said, no, we can't do that, and we won't support that. And they went to see Baldwin. There's some dispute over what Baldwin said. Baldwin denied he'd said it, but I think he did say it, but it's open. But he said, all the workers of this country have got to take a reduction in wages to help put the country back on its feet again. And that was a foolish thing to say because it united the other union behind the miners. So the miners could say it's not just our wages that are going to be reduced, but we're in the forefront of the labour movement. If our wages are reduced, your wages will also be reduced, and therefore it's in your interest, even apart from working class solidarity, to join us in a strike. And in 1925, it looked again as if there'd be another general strike, because the trade union as a whole, the TUC, said, if the miners are locked out because they won't accept lower wages, we will all go on strike. And then there will be a general strike. And the miners went to see the government again, and they said the government has to give a subsidy to the mines so that they can maintain the wages we're paying. And Baldwin, the Conservative, said, well, we're not going to do that. Why should we do that? Why should we pick up the mines rather than other industries that aren't doing well? Why should we subsidise the mines? We're not going to do that. And they were opposed. And Baldwin said to the miners, you know, what are you going to concede? And the miners said, nothing, we've got nothing to concede. And they had the slogan, not a minute off the day, in other words, no longer hours, and not a penny off the pay. So they weren't going to concede anything at all. Now, at the last moment, the government gave way on a date that, by contrast with Black Friday, happened to be another Friday, was called Red Friday. That was a victory for the unions. And they said they would give a subsidy to the mines of £10 million for 9 months. It turned into 23 million in the end. And they said that they would set up a royal commission to consider what should be done about the mines, and that royal commission would report before the 9 months were up, and hopefully that would achieve a settlement. Now, there's been dispute about why the government gave way, and some people say they were being very cunning, that they were waiting to fight on better grounds, as it were, when public opinion had been properly prepared. I don't myself believe that. I take the view that Baldwin was a genuine conciliator, and hoped that a strike averted might be a strike avoided. And it's important to remember that although you had conservative governments throughout most of the interwar period, those governments could only win power with the support of a minority, at least, of organised labour, of the trade unions. In other words, for the Conservatives to win an election, they needed about a third of the trade unionists to vote for them in those days. And so it wasn't in the interest of the Conservative Party to have a general strike and to have organised labour against them. And indeed, after the general strike, the 1926 general strike, in the next election in 1929, the Conservatives were defeated and you had a Labour government, so it wasn't in the interest of the Conservatives to put the unions against them. So I don't think it was a cunning move. I think Baldwin genuinely hoped to achieve a settlement. Now, this proved only a temporary truce. The left-wing union leaders in the miners' union said they had the government on the run, and this showed their power, and that next time they could push them even further. And Cook, the miners' leader, who was on the left, said, we have already beaten not only the employees, but the strongest government in modern times. Whereas the right wing of the Conservative Party said they did take the view we must fight later on when we're better prepared. Certainly, I don't think Baldwin took that view. And the Home Secretary, who was to the right, Sir William Johnson Hicks, made a speech saying the danger is not over. Sooner or later, this question has got to be fought out by the people of the land. Is England to be governed by Parliament and by the Cabinet, or by a handful of trade union leaders? Now, the Royal Commission reported in the spring of 1926, and they said that the trouble with the mines was that there were too many units, and some of them were very inefficient, and therefore wages tended to be dragged down to the level of inefficient mines. And the best thing to do would be to reorganise the mines so that they became more efficient, perhaps to have some degree of government control, not nationalisation, but planning, and get rid of the inefficient mines and generally rationalise the industry. And they said that was their long-term solution, but they said there was no alternative in the short term to cutting wages because the mines were uneconomic. And they said, nevertheless, the miners should be persuaded to accept all this on condition that there would be reorganisation, and that hopefully would raise the wages back again by making the mines more efficient. So in a way it had something for both sides. But the trouble was that wages were going to fall whatever happened, whereas reorganisation depended on government action and on the action of the employers. And reorganisation was a bit one of those magic words which seemed to promise great improvements in efficiency, but would they actually occur? It's like the words government used to save money, efficiency savings. Do they actually ever occur? Now, at this point, I think the Trade Union Congress was rather hopeful. They wanted to avoid a strike. And their line was, we think we can bring the miners along with you with a formula if the Prime Minister can deliver the owners along with him to agree to reorganisation of the mines. And they said, in this way, can we not find some formula, perhaps to paper over the cracks, so that we don't have to have a general strike, which the trade unions didn't, on the whole, want, I think. Now, the government said, what was right, I think, that restructuring would take years, and what was going to happen in the meantime? There had to be wage cuts. And the trade union said, trade union and Congress said, well, we accept this. We accept that there may have to be wage cuts, but they should be dependent on reorganisation. They were searching for a form of words that would get them off the hook of supporting the miners. The miners' position was there shouldn't be wage cuts, full stop. And the trade union said that was unrealistic. Let's have wage cuts, or have to have wage cuts, sadly, but on condition there be reorganisation. Try and pin the government down, try and get a form of words that gets out of all this. And the miners said, no, no, we don't agree to anything of that kind, and you must support us in all this. And the trade unions were saying this is a bit unrealistic, because if you're asking us to go on strike and risk our jobs, and remember it was a risk of a job, he said, you must entrust negotiations to us, and you must entrust us to find the right formula. You can't say there's going to be unity on the strike, but you're going to decide what the position is about negotiations. And therefore, you must hand over control of the strike to the General Council of the Trade Union Congress. And the miners said, no, that won't do. We're not going to do that. We decide what we want. So there was that problem. Now, the Prime Minister, Baldwin, I think, like the Trade Union Congress, wanted to get out of the strike and try and find a formula. And a draft, he produced the following form of words. He said, the Prime Minister satisfied himself that if negotiations are continued, it being understood that the notices cease to operate, in other words, that there wouldn't be a lockout, the representatives of the TUC are confident that a settlement can be reached on the lines of the report within a fortnight. Now, the lines of the report, the Royal Commission report, that meant a reduction in wages, but it wasn't spelt out, so the TUC could accept it without actually spelling things out too strongly. But the Cabinet rejected that. They said, you're going to be taken for a ride by the trade unions. They say they'll accept this, but they won't really, and you'll have the strike again. So we must tighten up the formula. And they said this. The formula was tightened up. We will urge the miners to authorise us to enter upon a discussion with the understanding that they and we accept the report as a basis of settlement, and we approach it with the knowledge that it may involve some reduction in wages. And those words, reduction in wages, spelt out what the Trade Union Congress didn't want spelt out, because it didn't get them off the hook with the miners. Now, the TUC, nevertheless, said they would take it to their members and report back to the government on the Sunday. These negotiations were carried out over the weekend when the notices were coming out on Monday, so the miners would go on strike. So they dispersed into the country. And one of those sad accidents that sometimes occurred, they did not ring back when they promised to ring back through pure breakdown of communications. And this led the Cabinet to think that they were being taken for a ride. And they said the strike notices for a general strike have already gone out. And the unions could reply, these were merely provisional, and after all the government had made its preparation, we're making our preparation, we want to get out of the strike. And then the Cabinet heard news. You've got to remember for all this time the Cabinet were very distant from the trade union movement, more distant than Conservatives would be today. They didn't understand it very well. And then news came in which really frightened them, because the printers on the Daily Mail had said they would not set up a headline called For King and Country, calling on the country to stand firm against a general strike. And they said this is an interference with freedom of speech. And they were very frightened, and they rang up the King's private secretary to say the Daily Mail will not be printed tomorrow. And the King's private secretary replied with some insouciance, we don't take the Daily Mail here or the Daily Express. But the union leaders then came back late on the Sunday evening, hoping to continue negotiations. But Baldwin met them and said, I've had this very serious news. Overt acts have occurred, such as the failure to print the Daily Mail, which indicates that the strike has started, it's outside your control. We've done our best, but gentlemen, I have to tell you, negotiations are now concluded, will not be resumed until you unconditionally withdraw all threats or promises of a general strike. Good night. And he went off. And the union leaders were totally surprised. They didn't know anything about this action by the printers, which was not official. And then went back to find out what was happening. And then they were going to report back to Baldwin and say, look, this is all a muddle. But Baldwin had gone to bed. It's all finished. And I think what happened, the cabinet said to Baldwin, you're being taken for a ride here, and you must stand up to the unions. It's about time you stand up to the unions. And the General Council, I think, were genuinely astounded when negotiations broke down. I think no one, in my opinion, some disagree with it, I think no one on the General Council wanted a general strike. They wanted to use the threat of the general strike to get the government to give a fair deal to the miners. I think some people in the cabinet, in my opinion, though not Baldwin, wanted a confrontation or almost welcomed it. Baldwin, I think, didn't. But the general strike, the national strike, the unions called the national strike. If you're on the union side, you mustn't call it the general strike. You have to call it the national strike. It's called differently by different people. The union said it was a national strike. And the clearest example of class warfare in the 20th century, you know, in many countries be thought of as a revolution, but fought by those who built their careers on abandoning the class war. A great paradox. Baldwin, leader of the Conservative Party, said we must conciliate, be more conciliatory than we've been in the past. Right-wing union leaders like Ernest Bevin and Citrine, the left accused of being class traitors, they were the leaders of the general strike. A disaster for the unions. 5 months after the strike, 200,000 were still on a 3-day week. 45,000 unemployed on the railways didn't get their jobs back. The trade unions lost a third of their funds. The miners weren't helped. The general strike lasted for 9 days. The miners' strike ended in December 1926. After 9 months, the unions lost everything they fought for. There were district settlements rather than national settlements, increase in hours and lower wages, back to the levels of 1921, a complete defeat. Summed up, and I'm going to finish with this, I hope to finish the interwar period today in domestic policy. I won't, so I'll continue next time talking about the 1931 crisis and another coalition government of Conservatives and Liberals, like the Lloyd George government, all sorts of resonances with today, and talk about that then. But I'll conclude with a comment made by the Fabian Beatrice Webb at the end of the strike. She said this, very prescient. She said, for the British trade union movement, I see a day of terrible disillusionment. The failure of the general strike will be one of the most significant landmarks in the history of the British working class. Future historians will, I think, regard it as the death gasp of that pernicious doctrine of workers' control of public affairs through the trade unions and by the method of direct action. And after the strike ended, she said this, the government has gained immense, and I think this sums up the interwar years, the government has gained immense prestige in the world, and the British labour movement has made itself ridiculous. A strike which opens with a football match between the police and the strikers and ends in unconditional surrender after 9 days, with densely packed reconciliation services at all the chapels and churches of Great Britain, attended by the strikers and their families, will make the continental socialists blaspheme. Let me add, the failure of the general strike shows what a sane people the British are. If only our revolutionaries would realise the hopelessness of their attempt to turn the British workman into a Russian Red and the British businessman and country gentleman into an Italian fascist. The British are hopelessly good-natured and full of common sense, to which the British workman adds pig-headedness, jealousy and stupidity. We are all of us just good-natured, stupid folk. The worst of it is the governing class are as good-natured and stupid as the labour movement.